Good afternoon, class. We're going to get started today, picking up where we left off. As you'll recall, in class today we were discussing the earliest stages of the French Revolution and how there was some fundamental flaws within French society. We talked about the anciens regime, which is essentially the French term for the old order, the way in which the French economy, government, and basic social relationships within French society, the way they were put together. And Louis XVI in 1788 faced a very difficult dilemma. He had two pretty poor choices. One, he could go bankrupt, or two, he could make the almost equally nauseating decision of agreeing to share his power with fellow aristocrats throughout France and call them into a meeting in Paris with the long ago parliamentary body, the Estates General, that had not been called together for over 150 years. He makes the latter decision, and it's important to understand that when the Estates General is called into being, it begins as a frustrating standoff between two powerful institutions within French society, the aristocrats on the one hand and the monarch, the king, on the other. But I'm not so sure that either side of that conflict really understood that by bickering and arguing with one another, they were essentially opening up a fresh avenue, and a really dangerous avenue as far as they were concerned, of allowing the third estate, the peasants and the merchant classes within French society, are going to use, I shouldn't say use because I don't think it was really that conscious, they're going to take advantage of an opportunity that becomes available to them. So in 1788, Louis XVI, having run out of options, decides that the financial picture, the financial setting of France in the late 18th century is so bad that he has to essentially call together these aristocrats in the hopes that they will extend to him greater capacity for collecting taxes, for collecting revenues, while at the same time, at least in with Louis's hopes, not take too much political power back from the centralized absolute monarchy that France had had grown accustomed to over the past 1-2 centuries. So that's the situation. Ooh. Okay, sorry, I thought I made a mistake there. So those are the circumstances. In 1788, he calls for a meeting of the Estates General, and it's not until 1789 that the electors or representatives that will be serving in the Estates General can actually meet. And so that does happen, and immediately upon gathering, there are some obvious challenges or issues that have to be worked out. The first is that traditionally, the last time the Estates General met, it took place back in the early 1600s. And at that time, what happened was everyone within the Estates General, every representative had a vote, and the positions or seats within the Estates General happened to be arranged whereby the first estate had 300, the second estate had 300 representatives, and the third estate had 300 representatives. Now, to anyone who was following the situation closely at all, would have known that that is a fundamentally unjust arrangement, largely because the third estate made up about 85% of French society, and clearly here they have no greater proportion of representation than the first and second estates had. So through this early frustration and anguish, a deal is reached whereby the third estate will be enlarged to 600 people. So on a per capita or per head basis, now the third estate has 600, and that is fully half of the total number of delegates at the Estates General. Now, that would have probably worked. Even you could argue that that was even an unfair arrangement, right? Because the third estate made up far more than half of French society. But nonetheless, it was a significant improvement, and for the most part, people were willing to accept that minor yet significant change. Now, things got really heated, however, when the Estates General came in to meet, and the Third Estate found itself locked out of the Assembly Hall. This was because the Third Estate had been informed that the new Estates General would determine its decisions based on a one vote per estate basis, meaning that on an issue, the First Estate as a collective would get one vote, the Second Estate as a collective would get one vote, and the Third Estate as a collective would get one vote. This, of course, neutralized any numerical advantage that the Third Estate may have had in terms of representing the French populace as a whole. The Third Estate bolted and used this opportunity to essentially chart a new course for political bodies and political decision-making in France. In 1789, they are going to, at the tennis court oath, or I should say at the tennis court outside of the meeting place of the original Estates General, they will hold their own meeting, and in that meeting they will form the National Assembly, and they will dedicate that the Third Estate will not participate in the Estates General until a new constitution for France is written. So this becomes a very important stepping stone toward later developments in the French Revolution. Now, Louis XVI is looking on. He's seeing some instability emerge, not liking what he sees, and he's not completely inept. He knows that sometimes you have to play along with the masses even when you don't like the way they're playing. So he does, for a time, agree that the National Assembly is the important body for reaching decisions within France. You could argue that he knew that if he didn't accept this, he was placing his rule in further jeopardy. But then three really important developments happen in the summer of 1789. The first one starts July 14th. Even though Louis XVI was, at least by all appearances, playing along with the formation of this new National Assembly and acknowledging the anger and frustration of the Third Estate, there was still a lot of suspicion that he was not, in fact, in support of these new dramatic and sudden changes within France. And who could blame him? If you were powerful, of course you're going to have a reluctant philosophy toward change. You're going to be conservative, right? And Louis XVI was only progressive because the times called for that. And he was only progressive in word. He was not progressive in deed. So at this time, rumors spread, and there's probably some truth to them, that Louis was quietly preparing to bring military forces to Paris and situate them throughout the city to secure what was otherwise becoming an unstable situation. And based on these rumors and perceptions, the French, the urban masses of Paris began to agitate, began to act for fear that if they did not act first, they would be acted upon by the king's military. And so what they do is they try to solidify their position. They raid the Bastille. The Bastille was a big armory. You can see a picture of it here in this picture. And this armory was essentially a secure place within Paris. The purpose of this armory was to secure people, so it was part prison, and then it was also part a munitions depot. It was a place to house and protect guns, and more importantly, gunpowder. That might sound like a terrible combination, to keep people, prisoners, and guns and gunpowder together, but if you think about it in the larger context of that time, this was one of the few secure buildings in Paris. And so it was a place that you would put all things that you needed to secure and lock down very tightly. Anyway, the mobs are going to invade the Bastille, They successfully topple and enter in, but not without some real casualties. Dozens of revolutionaries, or I will say radicals, that are seeking to invade the Bastille are going to be shot down and killed as a result of this conflict. But they do enter in, they accomplish their objectives of securing weapons, securing gunpowder. They kill the governor who is in charge of the Bastille at this time. They place his head on a pike. They parade it through the streets of Paris, and this is a very early instance of the revolution reaching greater heights, or a greater crescendo within France. The second of the three big developments of the summer of 1789 is going to be the Great Fear. The Great Fear was a rural set of developments, and in the Great Fear, rural peasants throughout France rose up to attack the chateaus and castles that were situated largely in the outlying regions of France. And it was as if instability and revolution were in the air, and I can't help but think of, at different times in American history when there has been instability. I'm thinking of like the Watts riots of the late 1960s, or the Rodney King riots of the 1990s, or any riot when an NHL team wins a Stanley Cup and people start turning cars over in the streets. You can think a little bit about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and how that instability sort of turned society for a brief period of time into a state of nature where people were rising up, looting, so on and so forth. Well, in the French Revolution, in the late summer of 1789, when the people revolted in the countryside, oddly enough, they weren't breaking into stores to steal goods. They were actually breaking into castles to destroy records. And that might seem strange, but really what these people were doing is, in the process, they were deleting any feudal records of what they owed to their lords or the aristocrats in their midst. And this was an effective priority in the sense that by destroying these, they could effectively eliminate the fees, taxes, labor conscriptions that they might owe to their aristocratic betters, and any taxes, any labor, so on and so forth. So oddly enough, the Great Fear becomes a powerful chapter, and some historians have actually suggested that perhaps the Great Fear occurs because people were eating a certain wheat rust, that there was essentially a blight because of the famine. Some of the wheat that normally would have been thrown away because it was rotten was actually being consumed, and that this wheat had a little bit of a rust on it, which is essentially like how would we refer to this? A blight. That it was essentially spoiled food. They're eating it anyway, and it actually had some psychedelic properties, this rust that was on the wheat, and it may have actually elevated the frenzy of the revolution in rural areas, which is sort of a fascinating theory that's been attached to the revolution. Okay, so also by the latter part of the summer of 1789, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen is passed. This gives a little bit greater force and form to the early revolution, and of course what this does is it formally ends any differences that exist between the French people and their aristocratic betters. At the end, I will close with this, at the end of 1789, the third big accomplishment of 1789 is that the women of the fish markets, who are hungry, tired, and angry, fed up with the king, fed up with the queen in particular Marie Antoinette, they march on Versailles, and they essentially kidnap the king and queen and bring them back to Paris, where they will from that point on live in the Tuileries Palace, the old palace before Versailles.